The story begins in the late 1960s, a time when respect for authority was non-negotiable and teachers ruled classrooms with ironclad discipline. Evelyn Thompson was just 16, full of wild ambition and teenage rebellion. She had dreams of becoming an artist, dreams so vivid they kept her up at night sketching under her blanket with a flashlight in hand. Her father worked long hours at the local factory, and her mother juggled part-time jobs cleaning houses. Neither of them understood her obsession with all that drawing nonsense, as her father called it. But Evelyn didn't care. Her dream was hers alone, until she met Mrs. Eleanor Graves. Mrs. Graves was a tall, sharp-featured woman in her late 50s, known for her rigid teaching style and no-nonsense demeanor. She wore her gray hair in a tight bun that seemed to defy gravity, and her steel-rimmed glasses sat on the bridge of her nose like a judge waiting to deliver a sentence. Every student feared her. She wasn't mean in the traditional sense, but she was relentless. There was no such thing as good enough in Mrs. Graves' class. Her critiques were sharp, unyielding, and often public. "This is sloppy work, Evelyn," she'd say, tapping a red pen against Evelyn's sketches. "You think people in the real world will applaud mediocrity? Fix it." Evelyn's face would burn with embarrassment as the other students snickered. The humiliation was a slow boil, turning into quiet resentment. At first, Evelyn tried to impress her. She stayed up late redoing assignments, adding more detail, more color, more passion. But no matter what she submitted, Mrs. Graves had something to say. "Overworked, too abstract, or this lacks discipline," she'd write in the margins. One day, Evelyn finally snapped. It was an autumn morning, the chill still clinging to their jackets, and Mrs. Graves had just returned their latest project, self-portraits. Evelyn had poured her heart into hers, capturing her own likeness with soft shades of blue and lilac to convey her inner world. But there, in red ink, was the word that broke her, unfocused. "That's it," Evelyn barked, shooting up from her desk. The room went silent. "You never have anything good to say about my work. It's always wrong, wrong, wrong. Maybe you're the one who doesn't get it." The entire class gasped. Mrs. Graves froze, her eyes narrowing behind those steel-rimmed glasses. Slowly, she set her pen down. "Sit down, Evelyn," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "If you can't handle criticism, you won't last a day in the real world." The words stung worse than anything she'd ever written on Evelyn's paper. The moment marked the beginning of an unspoken war between them. From that day forward, every interaction between Evelyn and Mrs. Graves felt like a battle of wills. Evelyn stopped caring about perfecting her assignments. Instead, she leaned into defiance. She'd submit bold, chaotic pieces, knowing Mrs. Graves would hate them. And when she got them back covered in red ink, she'd smirk as if to say, "I knew you'd hate it." It became a cycle. Evelyn provoked, Mrs. Graves corrected, and neither would back down. Her classmates told her to just let it go, but Evelyn refused. "She's not going to break me," she told her best friend, Clara, as they walked home one day. "She can't tell me how to be an artist. Nobody can." Graduation day was supposed to be a celebration, a moment of pride. For most students, it was. But for Evelyn, it was about one thing: walking out of that school knowing she'd never have to see Mrs. Graves again. As she lined up in her cap and gown, she spotted her at the edge of the auditorium stage, clipboard in hand, checking names off a list. Evelyn locked eyes with her for a brief moment. Mrs. Graves gave a small nod, not a smile, not a frown, just a nod, as if acknowledging that their chapter was over. Evelyn turned her head away and never looked back. Years passed. Evelyn's dreams of being an artist evolved into something more practical. She married a kind-hearted man named Charles and had 2 daughters, Grace and Lillian. She still sketched from time to time, but life had other demands. Bills had to be paid, kids needed to be fed, and art took a back seat to reality. As the years rolled on, she found joy in smaller, quieter moments, like baking cookies with her grandkids or watching her favorite old movies with Charles on Sunday evenings. It was a simple, content life, but every now and then, she'd look at her old sketchbooks and wonder if she'd given up on something bigger. Her grandson, Liam, was a bright, curious boy with a head full of curls and a mind that never stopped asking questions. He was unlike his cousins, more sensitive, more imaginative, and some would say a bit different. He loved puzzles, riddles, and figuring out how things worked. But he also struggled in school. While his cousins excelled at sports and math, Liam lagged behind. Teachers sent home notes saying he was distracted and easily overwhelmed. But Evelyn knew better. She saw it for what it was. He was just like her, a dreamer, an artist, a mind that didn't fit neatly into a box. She adored him for it. But school wasn't as forgiving as Evelyn was. Liam's struggles became more pronounced as he moved to higher grades. He'd come home exhausted, his tiny face crumpled in frustration. "I'm dumb, Grandma," he mumbled one day, tears running down his cheeks. Evelyn knelt before him, wiping his face with her sleeve. "Don't you ever say that," she said, her voice trembling. "You hear me? You're brilliant, Liam. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." She hugged him tightly, remembering how it felt to be told she wasn't good enough. Then came the day everything changed. It was a Sunday dinner, the kind where the whole family gathered around the table for roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and laughter. As they ate, Grace mentioned a piece of news that stopped Evelyn cold. "Liam's school hired a new after-school mentor," Grace said casually, slicing a piece of bread. "They're going to help kids like Liam with study skills and organization." Evelyn nodded approvingly, glad her grandson would be getting extra support. "Yeah," Grace continued, "it's this old retired teacher from the district. Mrs. Eleanor Graves, I think her name was." The room went still. Evelyn's fork froze halfway to her mouth. The air felt heavy, like a sudden shift in weather. She looked up slowly, disbelief and shock washing over her face. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice sharp enough to make everyone glance her way. Grace tilted her head, confused. "Mrs. Graves," she repeated. "She used to teach at your old high school, didn't she?" Evelyn felt her chest tighten, like she'd been winded by a punch she never saw coming. Her old nemesis, the woman she had vowed to forget. And now she was being put in charge of her grandson. Her mind raced. Memories of red ink, public humiliation, and unfocused echoed in her head like an old song on repeat. How could this woman of all people, be the one to guide her sweet, tender grandson? Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow. "No," she muttered, setting her fork down. "No, absolutely not." Everyone at the table turned to her, startled by her sudden outburst. "What do you mean, no?" Grace asked. "It's not like you get to choose." "I said no," Evelyn snapped. Her eyes darted from face to face. "She's not getting near Liam. Not her. Not that woman." Charles raised an eyebrow, his face lined with confusion. "Evelyn," he said gently, "what are you talking about?" Evelyn couldn't find the words. How do you explain decades of resentment boiling to the surface in one moment? How do you explain that the teacher who made you feel like you'd never be good enough was now about to shape your grandson's future? The past had found its way into the present, and Evelyn was determined to stop it, no matter the cost. This was no coincidence. It felt like fate was calling her to confront something she'd buried long ago. But fate doesn't play fair. Fate brings you face to face with the very thing you swore you'd never face again. The question was, would she fight it like she did as a teenager, or would she find another way? The days after that fateful Sunday dinner were tense. Evelyn couldn't shake the growing sense of dread that settled in her chest. It wasn't just discomfort, it was something deeper, something older. It was the ghost of her past, tapping on her shoulder like a long-forgotten debt collector. She'd spent decades building a peaceful life, only for Eleanor Graves to claw her way back into it. Every morning, Evelyn woke up hoping it had all been a mistake. Maybe Grace got the name wrong. Maybe it wasn't that Mrs. Graves. But every hope crumbled when she checked her phone and saw the school's official email. Dear parents and guardians, we are pleased to welcome Mrs. Eleanor Graves as our new academic support mentor. The name was right there in black and white. Evelyn could barely read the rest of the email. Her fingers hovered over the phone screen, trembling with anger she didn't know she still had. She set it down like it was something poisonous. Unbelievable, she muttered to herself, pacing the kitchen floor. Every step echoed the pounding of her heart. She didn't want to tell anyone how much it affected her, but her family wasn't blind. Charles noticed her sour mood immediately. He'd been married to her for 42 years. He knew when something wasn't right. Evelyn, he said, folding the newspaper in his lap, you've been walking around this house like a storm cloud all week. What's going on? She glanced at him, lips pressed tight, but didn't answer. Don't act like I can't see it, he added. You're stewing. I know that look. Evelyn wiped her hands on a dish towel, gripping it tighter than she needed to. It's her, she finally admitted, her voice low and sharp. Mrs. Graves. She spat the name like it left a bad taste in her mouth. Charles raised his eyebrows, puzzled. Mrs. Graves? From high school. Evelyn nodded, tossing the towel onto the counter like it had personally wronged her. She's Liam's new mentor. That's what this is about? Charles asked, chuckling as if it were a joke. Evelyn, that was 50 years ago. You really still hung up on that old teacher. The dismissiveness in his tone made her snap. Don't laugh at me, Charles, she shot back, turning toward him with eyes like daggers. You didn't sit in that classroom. You didn't feel the way she made me feel. Her voice cracked at the end, and for a second she hated that it did. Hated that her emotions were still so raw. Charles's face softened, his smile fading. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I'm not laughing, Ev, he said quietly. But I'm saying, maybe it's time to let it go. Let it go, she repeated, her voice rising. You think I want to hold on to this? You think I haven't tried to let it go? Her breath was shaky now, her chest tight with years of pent-up frustration. She made me feel small, Charles. Every day, she chipped away at me. No matter how hard I tried, it was never enough for her. It's not about some grudge. It's about protecting Liam from that. Her eyes darted to the living room, where Liam sat cross-legged on the rug, quietly building a Lego tower. Her heart squeezed. I won't let her do to him what she did to me, she added, her voice firm with the resolve only a grandmother could have. Charles sighed, leaning back in his chair. He watched her for a long moment, then glanced at Liam. He's not you, Evelyn, he said softly. And maybe she's not the same person either. But Evelyn wasn't ready to hear that. Not yet. 2 weeks later, Evelyn was sitting in the parking lot of Liam's school, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her heart thudded against her ribs like it was trying to escape. She knew exactly what she had to do. She was going to walk into that school, find whoever was in charge, and tell them that under no circumstances was Eleanor Graves allowed to mentor her grandson. It was a simple plan, and yet she couldn't get out of the car. Every time she reached for the door handle, her mind filled with flashes of red ink and those sharp, cutting remarks. Her fingers hovered in the air, frozen. She sat there for 20 minutes. Parents came and went, dropping off their kids, laughing, chatting. Evelyn stayed. Her breathing was shallow, her hands cold, her heart stubbornly locked in the past. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath, but she still didn't move. Every second she sat there, the harder it became to open that door. It was like facing a lion in the wild. You tell yourself it's just an animal, but your body doesn't listen. Then, like fate itself was testing her, she saw her. Eleanor Graves. There she was, stepping out of the school entrance with that same posture, that same rigid stance. Her hair wasn't in a bun anymore, but her presence was unmistakable. She was older now, her steps slower, but the authority she carried hadn't dimmed. Evelyn's breath hitched. "She's smaller than I remember," she thought, surprised. But the weight in her chest didn't feel any lighter. She ducked her head, suddenly afraid Eleanor might spot her. She felt like a child again, hiding in plain sight. The old woman helped a group of children out of a van, her voice soft but firm. "Come on now. Hands to yourselves," she said, waving them forward like a mother hen guiding her chicks. Evelyn watched in disbelief as the children followed her instructions without complaint. No barking orders, no harshness, just calm authority. What is this? Evelyn thought. Where's the tyrant I remember? But she didn't let herself believe it. She couldn't. People don't change that much, she told herself. People don't get softer, they just get better at hiding it. And Eleanor Graves had been hiding who she really was for decades. Evelyn was sure of it. When Liam got into the car later that day, she turned to him. "How was school, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice tighter than usual. "It was okay," he mumbled, buckling himself in. Evelyn watched him closely. She didn't want to ask, but she couldn't stop herself. Did you see Mrs. Graves today?" Liam nodded, pulling his seatbelt across his chest. "Yeah," he said casually. "She's nice." Evelyn gripped the steering wheel again, her nails pressing into the leather. She wanted to press him for more details. What did she say? What did she do? Did she make you feel small? Did she embarrass you in front of the other kids? But she didn't ask. She just drove, quiet and tense, the air between them heavy with unspoken thoughts. Over the next few weeks, Evelyn watched Liam carefully. She expected him to come home one day, looking defeated. She braced for it, ready to step in, ready to protect him. But it never came. Instead, he came home talking about things Mrs. Graves had taught him, new ways to organize his schoolwork, little tricks she showed him for staying focused. "Grandma, she taught me this thing with flashcards," he said one afternoon, his face beaming with pride. "Look, I made my own." He held up a stack of bright yellow cards with words neatly written in marker. He was excited, proud of himself. Evelyn watched him shuffle them like a magician showing off a new trick, and something shifted in her chest. "She's different," Charles said later that night, sensing her mood. "Maybe you should be, too." But Evelyn didn't answer. Her pride was a fortress built over decades, and fortresses don't fall in a day. Weeks had passed, and despite Evelyn's best efforts to maintain her vigilance, something peculiar began to happen. Each day, Liam came home with stories, not complaints, not tears, but stories. Happy stories. Stories filled with phrases like, "Mrs. Graves showed me how to do this," or "Mrs. Graves said I'm getting better at this." At first, Evelyn brushed it off as a fluke. Children are easily impressed, she told herself. But as the stories piled up, she found herself listening more closely, her eyes narrowing with quiet suspicion. "Grandma, guess what?" Liam said one afternoon, his eyes wide with excitement. He set his backpack down with a thud, pulling out a crumpled sheet of paper. "I got a sticker. Mrs. Graves said my work was excellent." His face glowed with pride as he held the paper up like it was a trophy. There in the corner was a gold star sticker and in neat cursive the words, "Excellent work, Liam. Keep it up." Evelyn's eyes zeroed in on the handwriting. She knew that script. Sharp, precise, and unmistakably familiar. It was her handwriting. Mrs. Graves' handwriting. The same handwriting that had once scrawled unfocused and try harder on her drawings. Her stomach twisted. It didn't matter if it said excellent now. She could still feel the sting of those old words, like a scar she thought had healed but never really had. "That's great, sweetheart," Evelyn said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "But you don't need a sticker to know you did a good job." Liam tilted his head, confused. "I know," he replied simply, grinning. "But it feels nice when someone else sees it too." His words hit her harder than she expected. She thought back to all those years she spent chasing validation in Mrs. Graves' classroom. Back then, she wanted so desperately for Mrs. Graves to see her, to recognize her talent. She didn't want a gold star. She wanted to be seen. Her throat tightened, but she swallowed it down. "Not today, Evelyn," she told herself. "Not in front of him." Later that night, after the house had gone quiet and Charles was dozing off in his recliner, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. Her fingers traced the rim of the mug as she stared blankly at the paper Liam had shown her. That sharp, familiar cursive danced in front of her eyes, pulling her back to the past. Her mind replayed every critique, every argument, every moment she had tried to prove herself in that classroom. Her tea had gone cold by the time she finally muttered to herself, "People like her don't change." But that certainty was starting to crack. She could feel it. The following week, Grace asked Evelyn for a favor. "Mom, I need you to pick up Liam from school on Friday," she said over the phone. "I've got a late shift at work, and Charles is at his doctor's appointment." Evelyn hesitated. She didn't want to go back to that school, not with Mrs. Graves inside. But she also knew Grace didn't have many other options. "Fine," Evelyn said with a sigh. "But I'm picking him up at the curb. I'm not going inside." Okay, Grace said, laughing. "No one's asking you to storm the castle." On Friday, Evelyn sat in the car outside the school, parked near the front entrance. She drummed her fingers on the steering wheel, glancing at the large glass doors, half expecting to see Mrs. Graves walk out with her sharp eyes and clipboard in hand. She didn't know why she was so tense. It wasn't like she'd have to talk to her. All she had to do was wait for Liam to run out. But as the clock ticked past the pickup time, her patience wore thin. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Her fingers tapped the steering wheel more forcefully. "Where is he?" she muttered, craning her neck to get a better view. A few parents were walking in and out of the building, but there was no sign of Liam. Her heart started to pound, each beat a little harder than the last. "I told him I was waiting at the curb. Why isn't he out yet?" Another 5 minutes went by. Her breathing grew shallow. Her hand hovered over her phone, ready to call the school office, but before she could dial, she saw something that made her freeze. Mrs. Graves. There she was, walking out of the school with Liam at her side. They were deep in conversation, his head tilted up, his eyes locked on her with admiration. She wasn't scolding him. She wasn't lecturing him. She was listening intently. Evelyn watched them walk together, hand in hand, like they'd known each other for years. Her chest tightened, the sight unraveling something deep inside her. Evelyn's hands gripped the steering wheel harder than she meant to. Her nails dug into the leather, her jaw clenched tight. She watched as they approached the car, her eyes tracking every step like she was watching a slow-motion scene in a movie. She told herself she wouldn't look directly at Mrs. Graves. But as soon as they were close, their eyes met. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson," Mrs. Graves said, giving a polite nod. Her voice wasn't sharp. It wasn't cold. It was normal. Human. "Don't engage," Evelyn told herself. Just take Liam and leave. But her voice betrayed her. "Hello, Mrs. Graves," she said, and it came out colder than she intended. Her eyes darted to Liam, who was already climbing into the back seat. "Took you long enough," Evelyn added, looking at Mrs. Graves. She thought it would land like a jab, but Mrs. Graves just tilted her head, that same old calculating look on her face. "Patience is a hard lesson for some," Mrs. Graves replied with a slight smile. It wasn't smug. It wasn't sharp. It was kind. Evelyn's eyebrows shot up, but before she could think of a retort, Liam's voice piped up from the back seat. "Grandma, Mrs. Graves said I'm good at puzzles," he said proudly, his grin wide and toothy. Evelyn glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his face glowing with pride. "She says I notice patterns that other kids don't." The words lingered in the air longer than they should have. Evelyn swallowed hard, something tightening in her throat. "Notices patterns that others don't." She didn't know why, but it hit her like a brick. She blinked slowly, her eyes darting to Mrs. Graves, who was still standing outside the car, watching her. They didn't say another word. Mrs. Graves nodded one last time, as if they'd reached some unspoken agreement. Evelyn put the car in drive and pulled away, heart pounding like a drumbeat in her chest. That night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling in the dark. Charles was snoring softly beside her, but she was wide awake. Her mind replayed every moment, Liam's pride, Mrs. Graves' soft smile, and that one phrase that wouldn't leave her alone. "You notice patterns that others don't." It was something her own father had once said to her when she was sketching as a girl. "You see things other people miss," he told her. "That's a gift, Evie." Her eyes stung with unexpected tears. Her breath hitched in her chest, and she let out a sharp exhale, trying to steady herself. She didn't know why she was crying, but once it started, she couldn't stop. Memories flashed in her mind, the red ink on her sketches, the quiet longing to be seen, the way she built her life around proving that she was worthy of praise, even if it never came. What if she's changed? She thought, tears hot on her cheeks. What if she was trying to teach me something all along? The thought made her feel fragile, like glass barely holding together. Her pride told her she was being foolish. People don't change. But her heart wasn't so sure anymore. It had taken her 50 years to see it, but maybe, just maybe, Mrs. Graves had noticed something in her all those years ago. Something she couldn't see in herself. Her fingers brushed against her pillow, and she wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her nightgown. She hated that it took so long to see it. But patterns, as Liam had so innocently pointed out, aren't always easy to spot. Not until someone shows you how. Evelyn woke up the next morning feeling heavier than usual. Not tired, heavy. It wasn't the kind of weight that sleep could shake off. It was something deeper. She went through her morning routine the same as every other day. Feed the cat, brew her coffee, tidy up the kitchen, but everything felt slower, more deliberate. Her thoughts moved like syrup, sticky and slow, replaying every moment from the day before. She kept seeing Mrs. Graves' face in her mind. That calm smile, the way she nodded at Evelyn with no hostility, no smugness, just understanding. It gnawed at her. Sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, she found herself staring at Liam's paper again. The words, "Excellent work, Liam. Keep it up," stood out like they were written in neon. She could hear that same sharp, precise voice from years ago, not on his paper, but on hers. She could hear it clear as day, unfocused. Try harder. Her fingers ran along the paper's edge, tracing the letters. For the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, Mrs. Graves hadn't been trying to hurt her back then. No, that's ridiculous, she thought, shaking her head. She didn't care about me. She just liked being in control. But doubt was a patient visitor. It sat quietly, tapping at the back of her mind. She hated that it was there. Later that afternoon, Grace called with another favor. "Hey, Mom, I know it's short notice, but can you pick up Liam from school again? I got stuck in traffic, and I'm not going to make it." Evelyn hesitated, gripping the phone tighter than necessary. She didn't want to do it. Not after yesterday. But saying no would mean explaining why, and Evelyn didn't have the energy to get into all that. "Fine," she muttered, "but tell them to have him waiting outside." "Got it, Mom," Grace replied. "Thanks. You're a lifesaver." Evelyn pulled into the school parking lot 20 minutes later. Her eyes scanned the entrance, searching for Liam. She spotted a few kids running out to their parents, laughing and chattering as they climbed into cars. But Liam wasn't there. Not again. Her fingers tapped anxiously on the steering wheel as she checked the time. Where is he? Another 5 minutes passed. No Liam. Her heart started to thud a little harder. She could feel the familiar pulse of worry growing louder in her ears. She told herself to be patient, but patience had never been her strong suit. Finally, she spotted him, and her breath caught in her chest. Liam was walking out with Mrs. Graves. Again, they were side by side, her hand resting gently on his back as they walked slowly, talking. Not in a rush. Not like there was anywhere urgent to be. Evelyn's fingers curled around the steering wheel so tight that her knuckles turned white. Her breath came out shallow, uneven. She watched them the way a hawk watches prey, her eyes sharp and suspicious. She didn't want to admit it, but she was studying Mrs. Graves, watching for something, a sign of the old woman she remembered, a flicker of the coldness she used to know. But it didn't come. As they reached the car, Evelyn rolled down the window. "Liam, come on," she called, trying to sound neutral, but failing miserably. She glanced up at Mrs. Graves, her eyes sharp as glass. "I thought he was supposed to be out here already." Mrs. Graves didn't miss a beat. She leaned down, resting her hands on her knees to meet Evelyn's eye level through the car window. Her face was calm, not condescending, not confrontational, just calm. "He wanted to finish his puzzle," Mrs. Graves said softly, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. "And when a child wants to finish something, sometimes it's good to let them." Her gaze was steady, unshaken, like she was offering Evelyn a choice. Push back or understand. For the first time in decades, Evelyn had no comeback. Her throat tightened, words refusing to form. Her eyes flickered to Liam, who was climbing into the back seat, his smile bright and wide. "Grandma, I solved it," he said, his voice bursting with pride. "She showed me how to look for the pieces that don't fit." He held up a small puzzle piece like it was a rare gem, grinning ear to ear. "She said sometimes the thing that doesn't fit is the most important piece." Evelyn felt something shift in her chest. The thing that doesn't fit is the most important piece. Her mind swirled with the weight of it. Those words hung in the air longer than they should have. Her eyes flicked up to Mrs. Graves, who was already standing up, brushing off her hands. Did she say that on purpose? Evelyn wondered. Did she know what that would mean to me? "Have a good afternoon, Mrs. Thompson," Mrs. Graves said, taking a step back from the car. Her tone wasn't smug. It wasn't sharp. It was kind. Evelyn hated that it was kind. It would have been easier if she'd been cruel. It would have been easier if Mrs. Graves had been the villain she remembered. She could handle villains. She'd been holding her grudge like armor for 50 years, and villains are easy to fight. But kindness was disarming. Kindness made you question everything. That night, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table again, the same place she'd sat every night for the past week. The house was quiet, but her mind was loud. Charles had already gone to bed, and the soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. She traced the edge of Liam's puzzle piece, which she found tucked in his backpack after dinner. Small, simple, ordinary. Just a puzzle piece. She turned it over in her hand, thinking about the way Liam's eyes had lit up. The thing that doesn't fit is the most important piece. Her fingers trembled as she placed the puzzle piece down on the table. Her eyes lingered on it for a moment, then she stood up and walked to the hall closet. It took a few minutes of searching through old boxes, but she finally found it. Her old high school sketchbook. The pages were yellowed with time, the edges soft from years of being flipped through. Her heart pounded as she opened it. The first page hit her like a slap to the face. Her old self-portrait, the one Mrs. Graves had torn apart with criticism. Unfocused, it said in red ink in the corner. She ran her fingers over the word, her breath catching in her chest. Unfocused. But this time, it didn't feel like an attack. It felt honest. She studied her old work the way Mrs. Graves might have. The shading was uneven. The proportions were off. Not because Evelyn wasn't talented, but because she hadn't finished. She'd stopped before it was done. She'd walked away from it, just like she'd walked away from Mrs. Graves, carrying all that resentment with her like luggage. Her eyes blurred with tears, and she closed the sketchbook with a soft thud. Her breathing was shaky now, her chest rising and falling in uneven waves. Her pride had been her armor for so long, but now it felt like a cage. And cages don't protect you, they trap you. That night, she couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned until 2 a.m. when she finally gave up and went back to the kitchen. She opened her sketchbook again, flipping to a blank page. Her hands hovered over it, her fingers tingling with the old, familiar feeling. She reached for a pencil. Her grip was hesitant, like her body wasn't sure if it remembered how. But as soon as the graphite touched the page, something clicked. Her hand moved slowly at first, sketching the soft curve of a face. Not her face. Not her younger self. Mrs. Graves. It startled her when she realized it. She was drawing Mrs. Graves. Her fingers moved without her permission, every line smoother than the last. The bun in her hair, the sharp edge of her glasses, the lines of age carved into her face, not with cruelty, but with time. She stopped halfway, staring at the image. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. Her breath caught in her throat, her chest feeling both heavy and light at the same time. Her tears fell freely now, landing softly on the page, blending with the graphite lines. The thing that doesn't fit is the most important piece. Her fingers hovered over the page for a moment before she reached for the pencil one more time. At the bottom of the sketch, in small, sharp cursive, she wrote 2 words. "Thank you." Evelyn sat at the kitchen table the next morning, the sketchbook still open in front of her. The image of Mrs. Graves stared back at her like an old friend she hadn't seen in years. The soft light of dawn filtered through the window, washing the page in pale orange and gold. Her pencil lay next to it rolled slightly to the side, as if waiting for her to pick it up again. She hadn't intended to draw Mrs. Graves. It had just happened. And now she couldn't stop looking at it. Her eyes traced every line, from the strands of Mrs. Graves' hair to the folds of her blouse. For the first time, Evelyn saw something she'd never noticed before: weariness. Not exhaustion, but the kind of quiet weariness that only comes from carrying other people's burdens for too long. It wasn't a face of cruelty. It was a face of patience, of effort. She felt something shift in her chest, something she didn't have a name for yet, but it made her eyes sting. Was this how she always looked? Evelyn wondered. Or was this just how she was seeing her now? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of small footsteps coming down the hallway. It was Liam, still in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes with one hand and dragging his blanket behind him with the other. He yawned as he approached, climbing onto the chair beside her like it was a well-worn routine. His sleepy eyes blinked at the sketchbook. "Whoa," he said, leaning forward, his little hands pressing into the edge of the table. "Is that Mrs. Graves?" Evelyn tensed, her heart giving a single hard thump. "Yes," she admitted quietly, glancing down at him. "How'd you know?" "Looks like her," Liam said with a shrug, like it was obvious. "But she's smiling." Her eyes darted back to the page. She hadn't noticed it before, but he was right. The subtle curve of Mrs. Graves' lips wasn't quite a smile, but it wasn't a frown either. It was that quiet, knowing expression she'd seen on Mrs. Graves just a few days ago, the one that made her feel exposed and seen all at once. Her throat tightened. "She's nice," Liam added, resting his chin on his hands. "She tells me I'm good at things." He said it so simply, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Evelyn blinked slowly, her gaze fixed on the boy beside her. He was so sure of it. So sure that Mrs. Graves was kind. His small voice carried so much conviction that it felt heavier than all the years of Evelyn's resentment. "She tells me I'm good at things." She'd spent her whole childhood waiting to hear those words. Liam got them without even asking. Her hand twitched like it wanted to close the sketchbook, but she didn't. She let it sit open, let it exist. "Did she ever tell you that, Grandma?" Liam asked suddenly, his eyes big and curious. Evelyn felt her chest tighten, her breath catching for just a moment. Her fingers curled against the table's edge. She didn't want to answer. Didn't want to tell him the truth. But for some reason, she couldn't lie to him. "No," she said softly. "No, she didn't." Liam frowned. "Why not?" he asked, his brows furrowing like he was ready to solve a mystery. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, letting out a long, slow breath. "Because I didn't think I needed to hear it," she said, her voice quieter now, almost like she was confessing it to herself. "I thought I had to prove it instead." Liam nodded like he understood, even if he didn't. Kids have a way of accepting things as they are, even when adults try to overcomplicate them. "But you're good at stuff," he said, still watching her carefully. "You're good at drawing. You're really good, Grandma." Her eyes stung again, tears welling up before she could stop them. She laughed a little, brushing at her face. "Thank you, Liam," she whispered, her voice shaking. "That means more than you know." The next few days were strange. Evelyn felt lighter, but she also felt more exposed. It's funny how carrying something for so long can feel normal, but when you put it down, you realize how heavy it actually was. She'd spent decades dragging that grudge behind her like an old suitcase. She carried it to family dinners, to holidays, to bed at night. She carried it into conversations, into her marriage, into every quiet moment she had to herself. And now it felt like she'd opened the suitcase and found nothing but air. But forgiveness isn't something you decide to do once. It's something you have to do again and again and again. The moment she realized that, she knew what she had to do. "Are you sure about this?" Charles asked that evening, leaning against the kitchen counter with a skeptical look. His eyes flicked from Evelyn to the phone in her hand. She was holding it like it might bite her, fingers hovering over the screen. "I'm sure," she said, but her voice had a tremor in it. "You don't have to call her," he added, arms crossed over his chest. "You don't owe her anything, Ev." Evelyn glanced at him, eyes steady. "I'm not calling for her," she said. "I'm calling for me." Charles tilted his head, studying her. His gaze softened after a moment, and he gave a slow nod. "All right," he said quietly. "Do what you need to do." Her thumb hovered over the call button. She could feel her heart in her throat, every beat loud and heavy. This wasn't like confronting her as a teenager. Back then, it was all fire and pride. But this was something scarier. This was walking into the unknown without armor. She pressed the button. The dial tone buzzed in her ear, each ring feeling longer than the last. Her pulse quickened. Her eyes stayed locked on the table, on the sketchbook still open to the drawing of Mrs. Graves. She thought about hanging up after the second ring. Maybe she'd get lucky and no one would answer. But then there was a click. Hello. Her breath caught. It was her. The voice was older now, raspier, but it was still unmistakable. Mrs. Graves. Evelyn closed her eyes for a second, gathering her strength. Hi, she said, her voice cracking like brittle glass. It's Evelyn Thompson. There was a pause on the other end. Silence stretched long and thin. Evelyn Thompson, Mrs. Graves repeated slowly, like she was dusting off an old memory. I remember you. Her tone wasn't sharp or cold. It was steady calm. Yeah, Evelyn said, her voice low. I wanted to say something I should have said a long time ago. She took a shaky breath, her hands gripping the phone like it might slip from her fingers. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the way I acted back then. Silence again. For a moment, Evelyn thought she'd been disconnected. But then Mrs. Graves spoke. You were young, she said softly, and you had fire in you. I never blamed you for that. Her voice sounded smaller somehow, like she wasn't speaking as a teacher, but as something else. Evelyn let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Her throat was tight with something she couldn't name. Relief, maybe. Grief, too. I thought you hated me, she admitted. I really did. No, Evelyn, Mrs. Graves said, her voice gentle now. I never hated you. I saw myself in you. And sometimes seeing yourself in someone else is the hardest thing of all. The tears came suddenly, hot and fast, blurring Evelyn's vision. She nodded even though Mrs. Graves couldn't see her. Her voice shook as she spoke. I see it now, she said, tears dripping onto the table. I see it now. They didn't say much after that, just silence. But it wasn't the kind of silence that needed filling. It was the kind of silence that made room for something new. When Evelyn hung up, she sat at the table for a long time. Her eyes drifted to the sketch of Mrs. Graves, still open, still raw. Her fingers reached for the pencil again, but this time she didn't hesitate. She drew a line where her lips should be. A smile. Not too big. Just enough. Her chest felt lighter than it had in years. Evelyn woke up feeling like something had been rearranged inside her. It wasn't the jarring, sudden kind of change. It was quieter, like shifting furniture in a familiar room. Things were still there, just different. The weight she carried for so long had lightened, and she didn't realize how much it had affected her until it was gone. Her first thought that morning was unexpected but clear. Go see her. The idea unsettled her. Why would I do that? She asked herself. The phone call had been enough. She'd said her piece, and Mrs. Graves had said hers. No need to drag it out. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It followed her as she made breakfast, as she swept the kitchen floor, and even as she folded laundry in the living room. She caught herself glancing at the clock, counting the hours until the end of the school day. Don't do it, Evelyn, she told herself. Just leave it alone. But by 1 p.m., she was in the car. The drive to the school felt like she was going to a place she'd never been before, even though she'd driven this route dozens of times. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, her knuckles going pale. Her heart beat steadily in her chest, not racing, but not calm either. Every block closer to the school felt like a step towards something she hadn't quite figured out yet. She pulled into the parking lot and sat there for a while, engine still running, fingers tapping anxiously on the steering wheel. Her eyes scanned the entrance like she was looking for an exit. She could leave. She didn't have to do this. But something deeper, something unspoken, told her she did have to do it. Her pride whispered for her to stay in the car, but something stronger, something softer, told her to go. "All right," she muttered, killing the engine. "All right." She stepped out of the car, her breath visible in the chilly afternoon air. Her hands were in her coat pockets as she made her way toward the entrance. Every step echoed in her ears, too loud, too steady. The school's front doors loomed like the gates of an old castle, and for a moment, she felt like a teenager again, standing at the edge of a battlefield she wasn't ready to fight. Her fingers hovered over the intercom button, and she swallowed hard before pressing it. "Yes," crackled the voice from inside. "Evelyn Thompson," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I'm here to see Mrs. Graves." There was a pause, just long enough to make her wonder if she'd be turned away. Then the buzz of the lock echoed, and the door clicked open. No turning back now. The hallway was as familiar as it was foreign. Clean tiles, bright fluorescent lights. It smelled faintly of crayons and cleaner. The last time she'd walked through a school hallway like this, she was 18, her heart full of fire and rebellion. This time, her heart was quieter, but no less fierce. She walked slowly, taking it all in. Her eyes flickered from the rows of lockers to the walls lined with student artwork. She spotted one that made her stop. A sketch of a face. The lines were messy but confident, full of movement and spirit. The eyes were uneven, the shading incomplete, but Evelyn didn't see flaws. She saw herself. Unfocused, she called it back then. But looking at it now, she saw something different. She saw courage. She saw the risk of trying something new. Her breath caught in her throat. She glanced down at the name in the corner of the drawing. Liam T. Her chest swelled with pride so sudden and sharp it hurt. She reached out, letting her fingers hover just inches from the paper. Her eyes blurred with tears, but she blinked them away. He's an artist, she thought, her heart aching in the best possible way. He's an artist, just like me. Beautiful, isn't it? The voice came from behind her. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. Sharp, precise, familiar. Evelyn didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Her breath was shallow as she slowly turned her head, locking eyes with Mrs. Graves. The older woman stood a few feet away, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her face was the same as it had always been, lined with age but steady as ever. But there was something different now, softness in her gaze that Evelyn had never noticed before. Her eyes flickered from Evelyn to the drawing on the wall. "Liam's work," Mrs. Graves said, nodding with approval. "He's got an eye for detail." Her lips curled into a small smile. "You must be proud." "I am," Evelyn said, her voice quieter than she meant it to be. Her eyes stayed on the drawing for a moment longer. Then she turned to face Mrs. Graves fully. They stood there for a moment, two women separated by years of misunderstanding, but somehow closer now than they'd ever been. Evelyn's hands fidgeted in her coat pockets, fingers curling and uncurling like they were searching for the right words. "Mrs. Graves," Evelyn started, her voice hesitant but firm, "I want to ask you something." "Go on," Mrs. Graves replied, tilting her head just slightly. Her face was calm, patient, the same way it had been with Liam. "Why me?" Evelyn asked, folding her arms over her chest like she was bracing for something heavy. Her eyes met Mrs. Graves and didn't waver. "Why were you so hard on me? Out of all the students, it felt like you were hardest on me." Her voice cracked at the end, but she didn't care. The words were finally out. Mrs. Graves' eyes softened. She let out a slow breath, nodding slowly, like she'd been waiting for this question for years. "Because you had something they didn't," she said quietly. Her eyes met Evelyn's with steady honesty. "Talent. Raw, wild talent." The kind that burns too bright if it isn't shaped. She shook her head slowly. I didn't want to put out your fire, Evelyn. I wanted you to learn how to control it. Evelyn's breath hitched. Her heart pounded in her ears. Her lips parted, but no words came out. You thought I was being cruel, Mrs. Graves continued, her voice like a gentle tap on glass. And maybe I was too harsh sometimes. I've made peace with that. She took a slow step closer. But I saw something in you that I saw in myself. And sometimes it's hard to be gentle with a mirror. Tears burned in Evelyn's eyes, hot and fast. She blinked them away, but they kept coming. Hard to be gentle with a mirror. The words hung in the air between them, weightless but heavy all at once. You're a stubborn one, Mrs. Graves added, her lips twitching into a small smile. Always were. I see that in Liam, too. Her eyes flickered back to the sketch on the wall, and her smile widened. He's going to be just fine. Evelyn let out a short, breathy laugh that came out more like a sob. She nodded, wiping at her eyes with the sleeve of her coat. Yeah, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Yeah, he is. For the first time in 50 years, Evelyn saw Mrs. Graves for who she really was. Not a tyrant, not a villain, but a woman who'd spent her life shaping flames so they wouldn't burn themselves out. She was tired now, her face lined with years of patience and effort, but she hadn't stopped. She never stopped. Thank you, Evelyn said, her voice low and certain. Mrs. Graves didn't say anything right away. She just nodded. A small, slow nod, the same one she'd given on graduation day all those years ago. The same one Evelyn had never understood until now. Take care, Evelyn, Mrs. Graves said quietly, her eyes kind and knowing. You too, Mrs. Graves, Evelyn replied. Her voice didn't shake this time. As she walked out of the school, her steps were lighter than they'd been in years. She glanced up at the sky, the gray clouds parting just slightly to let in the sun. It wasn't a bright, blinding light, just a soft glow, warm and steady. Back home, she sat at her kitchen table and pulled out her sketchbook. Her hand moved over the page like it always had, but this time she didn't hesitate. She didn't overthink it. The lines came naturally, bold, sharp, confident. Her fire had never gone out. She just needed to learn how to control it. Then,